I'm Eric Norland, Senior Economist with CME Group, here to talk about equity sectors, and more specifically, what causes certain sectors to either outperform or underperform the S&P 500 as a whole. Since equity sector futures were launched in 2011, we've seen essentially two distinct eras. First, from 2011 until about the middle of 2014, all of the equity sectors moved in tandem. Since the end of 2014, however, they've tended to grow apart, with certain sectors, including consumer discretionary, healthcare, and technology, vastly outperforming, while other sectors, including materials stocks, energy, and communication services, barely performing at all. Now, why is that? So in order to answer that question, we built a regression model that looks at how each of the individual sectors performs across the past 8 years with respect to 6 different factors, beginning with short-term interest rates. So when it comes to short-term interest rates, it turns out that higher short-term interest rates are great news for financial stocks. The banking system loves higher short-term interest rates, but most other stocks do not, and most especially the interest-sensitive sectors such as utility stocks and real estate. When it comes to long-term interest rates, it's a similar story. When 30-year yields, for example, rise with respect to 2-year yields, that tends to be pretty good news for banking stocks. Banks, after all, make money by borrowing short-term and lending long-term. However, higher long-term interest rates are not good news for utility stocks, for real estate stocks, as well as for other interest-sensitive sectors of the U.S. economy. Now, when it comes to inflation expectations, it's a somewhat similar story. Higher inflation expectations tend to be very bad news for consumer staple stocks, as well as for utilities, real estate, and communication services. But higher inflation expectations tend to correlate with an outperformance of the energy and the material sectors. But what about spikes in equity volatility or a sharp rise in the VIX index? Well, that tends to actually be bad news for all of the stocks in general. But certain sectors will outperform in a rising volatility environment. And those are usually the lowest risk sectors, such as utilities, consumer staples, and communication services. One thing to watch out for, however, technology stocks have been showing in the past 3 years a very strong tendency to have exceptionally deep sell-offs when there's a spike in the VIX index. So if you're long technology shares and you're concerned about a spike in volatility, you may want to consider reducing your exposure to that sector. Now, not surprisingly, higher energy prices are great news for energy stocks and not such great news for anybody else. When it comes to higher materials prices, such as copper prices, for example, that tends to be good news for the materials sector, also a good indicator for the industrial sector, but not such great news for interest-sensitive sectors such as utilities and real estate, which see higher copper prices as possibly a harbinger of higher short-term and maybe long-term interest rates. Finally, how well do our models explain all of the variance in these various equity sectors versus the S&P? Well, it varies a great deal by sector, but basically our model explains about half of the variance in certain sectors, including energy, utilities, and real estate, and about a quarter to a third of the variance in other sectors, such as financial services and consumer staple stocks. Other sectors, however, especially consumer discretionary, seem to beat to their own drummer. So if you're interested in reading more about equity sectors and how they perform and why they perform differently with respect to one another in the S&P index, please visit our website and look for our paper with more in-depth explanations.